Hello friends and welcome back. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of history's darkest chapters, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are. Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're just beginning your evening. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here. Tonight, we travel to Massachusetts in the year 1692. Picture a cold February morning in a small Puritan village called Salem. The wind cuts through wooden houses like a knife. Inside these homes, families huddle close to fireplaces, their breath visible in the frigid air. The winter has been brutal. Food stores run low. Tensions simmer beneath the surface of this deeply religious community. In one of these modest homes, something strange begins. Two young girls start behaving oddly. They contort their bodies in ways that seem impossible. They scream without reason. They speak words that make no sense. Their eyes roll back. Their limbs twist at unnatural angles. The village doctor examines them carefully. He checks for fever, for illness, for any physical ailment. He finds nothing. Then he utters words that will change everything. The evil hand is upon them. Salem Village was not just any colonial settlement. This was a community built on faith so intense it shaped every moment of daily life. These were people who had crossed an ocean to practice their religion freely. They believed God watched their every action. They believed Satan walked among them, always searching for souls to claim. They believed in a cosmic war between good and evil, and they believed that war was being fought in their very homes. But beneath this religious fervor lay something else. Salem Village was a place divided. Neighbors feuded over property lines. Families nursed grudges that stretched back generations. The village struggled for independence from the nearby town of Salem. Economic anxiety gripped many households. Social hierarchies were shifting. Old certainties were crumbling. Into this powder keg of fear, suspicion, and religious intensity came those two convulsing girls. Their affliction would become a spark. Within months, that spark would ignite an inferno that would consume the village. Before it ended, 19 people would hang from gallows. One man would be crushed to death under heavy stones. Dozens more would rot in jail cells. Hundreds would stand accused. This is not just a story about witches. This is a story about what happens when fear replaces reason. It's about how communities can turn on themselves. It's about the dangerous mix of absolute certainty and collective panic. It's about how quickly the familiar can become terrifying, how quickly neighbors can become enemies. The Salem witch trials lasted less than a year, but their shadow stretches across centuries. They remain a warning, a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice and the power of hysteria. They show us what we're capable of when we stop questioning and start believing absolutely. So settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight we walk through every stage of this tragedy. We'll meet the accusers and the accused. We'll stand in courtrooms where spectral evidence decided life and death. We'll watch as a community tears itself apart. Now let's begin. To understand Salem's madness, we must first understand Salem itself. The village sat in Essex County, Massachusetts, about 15 miles north of Boston. Founded in the 1620s, it was among the earliest Puritan settlements in New England. But Salem Village was not actually Salem proper. It was a rural farming community, legally part of Salem Town but increasingly resentful of that connection. Salem Town thrived on commerce. Merchants grew wealthy from shipping and trade. Their lives centered around the harbor, around business deals and material prosperity. Salem Village, by contrast, remained agricultural. Farmers worked hard soil for modest yields. They lived simply. They viewed the town's commercial success with suspicion and envy. This division ran deeper than economics. To the villagers, Salem Town represented dangerous worldliness. The merchants seemed to care more about profit than piety. The town attracted strangers, traders, sailors with loose morals. The village saw itself as spiritually pure, holding fast to the original Puritan vision while the town drifted toward corruption. But Salem Village had its own fractures. The Putnam family dominated much of village politics. They were established farmers with substantial landholdings. The Putnams wanted complete independence from Salem town. They wanted their own church, their own government, their own identity. Opposing them were families like the Porters, who maintained economic ties to the town and saw no benefit in separation. These competing factions fought over everything. They argued about who should serve as minister. They disputed property boundaries. They quarreled over taxation and representation. Lawsuits multiplied. Neighbors stopped speaking. At meeting-house gatherings, families sat in hostile silence or exchanged bitter words. The Puritans who settled New England brought with them an intense belief system. They saw themselves as God's chosen people, establishing a city upon a hill that would be a model Christian society. Every aspect of life held religious significance. Work was worship. Idleness was sin. They believed in predestination, that God had already determined who would be saved and who damned. Yet they also believed in visible sainthood, that the elect would demonstrate their salvation through righteous living. This created constant anxiety. How could you know if you were saved? You scrutinized your own behavior and that of your neighbors for signs of grace or damnation. Any deviation from accepted norms became suspicious. Any misfortune might be divine punishment for hidden sin. The Puritans also believed absolutely in Satan's reality. He was not a metaphor or symbol. He was a literal being with real power. He commanded legions of demons. He could take human form. He could work through intermediaries, people who had made pacts with him in exchange for earthly powers. These intermediaries were witches. Witchcraft was not theoretical. It was a crime in Massachusetts, punishable by death. The law explicitly recognized witchcraft's existence and danger. Previous witch trials had occurred in New England, though none would match Salem's scale. By 1692, Salem Village had endured particularly difficult years. Smallpox had ravaged the region. Frontier wars with Native Americans brought constant fear of attack. Refugees from destroyed settlements flooded into Salem, straining resources. The political situation remained uncertain after England's Glorious Revolution left Massachusetts without a proper charter or government. The village's minister added to tensions. Reverend Samuel Parris had arrived in 1689. He was controversial from the start. Some felt he demanded too much compensation. Others disliked his harsh, judgmental preaching style. Parris saw enemies everywhere. He preached frequently about Satan's presence in the community, about hidden sin, about the need for vigilance against evil. Parris owned 2 slaves from the Caribbean, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. In his household also lived his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams. It was in this powder keg of religious intensity, social division, economic anxiety, and ministerial paranoia that the first girls began to convulse. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The tragedy could now unfold. In February 1692, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began exhibiting strange behaviors. They would crawl under furniture and make odd sounds. Their bodies contorted into positions that seemed to cause them pain. They complained of being pricked by invisible pins. Sometimes they would freeze in place, unable to speak or move. Other times they would run about wildly, screaming incoherently. Reverend Parris called for the village doctor, William Griggs. Griggs examined the girls thoroughly. He found no fever, no rash, no physical signs of illness. In that era, medicine remained primitive. Doctors understood little about the human body or mind. When Griggs could find no natural explanation, he reached for a supernatural one. His diagnosis was bewitchment. Word spread quickly through the village. Soon, other girls began showing similar symptoms. And Putnam Jr., age 12, daughter of one of the village's most prominent families, started having fits. So did 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard, who lived with Dr. Griggs. 17-year-old Mercy Lewis, a servant in the Putnam household, joined them. Then came Mary Walcott, age 16, and Mary Warren, age 20. These afflicted girls, as they became known, formed the core of accusers. Their ages ranged from 9 to 20. Most came from farming families of middling status. Several were servants. They lived in a world that gave them little power or voice. Young women in Puritan society were expected to be quiet, obedient, invisible. Now, suddenly, they commanded everyone's attention. The adults around them needed answers. If the girls were bewitched, someone must be doing the bewitching. Reverend Paris pressed his daughter and niece to name their tormentor. They initially resisted, but under relentless questioning from Paris and other concerned adults, they finally spoke names. The first accused was Tituba, Paris's slave. The second was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered the village asking for charity. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant and who rarely attended church. Notice the pattern. All three women occupied the margins of Salem society. Tituba was enslaved and Caribbean. Sarah Good was poor and homeless. Sarah Osborne was old, ill, and had violated social norms. On February 29, 1692, warrants were issued for their arrest. The machinery of justice began turning. Local magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin would conduct examinations. These were not trials but preliminary hearings to determine if enough evidence existed to hold the accused for trial. The examinations took place in the village meeting house. The space was packed. This was high drama. The accused women were brought in one by one. The afflicted girls sat where everyone could see them. As each accused woman entered, the girls would begin their fits. They screamed. They convulsed. They claimed the accused woman's specter was attacking them at that very moment. Sarah Good maintained her innocence but showed anger and defiance. This hurt her case. Puritans expected accused persons to show humility and deference. Sarah Osborne also denied the charges but appeared confused and frightened. She was old and sick. The proceedings exhausted her. Tituba shocked everyone by confessing. Yes, she said, she was a witch. The devil had appeared to her. He looked like a tall man from Boston wearing black clothes. He had a book and made her sign it. She had seen other names in the book, though she could not read them. She described a conspiracy of witches operating in Salem. She mentioned animals that served as familiars for these witches. She spoke of flying through the night to secret meetings. Tituba's confession changed everything. Before, some villagers might have dismissed the girl's afflictions as illness or childish attention-seeking. But here was an adult confessing to witchcraft, confirming that the devil was indeed active in Salem. Her testimony about other witches meant the girls had named only the beginning. More witches must be hiding in the community. The logic became circular and deadly. If you denied being a witch, that proved your guilt because witches lie. If you confessed, that proved your guilt through admission. The only escape was to confess and then name others. This would show repentance and willingness to help root out evil. Confessors typically avoided execution, while those who maintained innocence faced death. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba were sent to jail in Boston to await trial. Sarah Osborne would die in prison. But the accusations did not stop. The afflicted girls continued having fits. They began naming new tormentors. Each name set off another wave of arrests, examinations, and jailings. The fire had been lit. Now it would spread. March 1692 brought escalation. The afflicted girls, emboldened by the adult belief in their visions, named more witches. Martha Corey became a target, which shocked the village. Unlike the first three accused women, Martha was a respectable church member. She attended meetings regularly. She lived a seemingly pious life with her husband Giles Corey. Martha made a crucial mistake. When asked about the accusations, she expressed skepticism. She suggested the afflicted girls might be imagining things or lying. In Salem's charged atmosphere, doubting the girls' testimony became evidence of guilt. Why would anyone defend witches unless they were a witch themselves? When Martha appeared for examination on March 21st, the meeting house overflowed with spectators. People stood in the aisles and crowded near windows. The afflicted girls performed dramatically. As Martha was questioned, they screamed that her specter was tormenting them. When Martha bit her lip, the girls cried out that invisible teeth were biting them. When Martha clasped her hands, they complained of being pinched. The examiner, John Hathorne, showed clear bias. His questions assumed guilt rather than seeking truth. Then came an accusation that shook Salem to its core. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman, was named as a witch. Rebecca was the embodiment of Puritan virtue. She had raised a large family. She was known for kindness and charity. Despite being nearly deaf and often bedridden with illness, she maintained her faith and good works. 39 community members signed a petition testifying to her character. But the Nurse family had enemies. They had feuded with the Putnams over land boundaries. Several of the afflicted girls had connections to the Putnam family. And Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers, was the daughter of Thomas Putnam, who had long-standing grievances against the nurses. Rebecca's examination revealed the cruelty of the proceedings. She was old, weak, confused by her deafness. She could barely hear the accusations. Yet the girls writhed and screamed, claiming her specter attacked them. The magistrates showed her no mercy or consideration for her age and condition. The accused expanded beyond marginal figures. Martha Corey was respectable. Rebecca Nurse was beloved. If they could be witches, anyone could. No one was safe. June 1692 marked the transition from accusation to execution. The court of Oyer and Terminer held its first session on June 2nd. The accused had languished in jail for months, some shackled, all enduring miserable conditions. Now they would face judgment. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop. She was about 60 years old and had been accused of witchcraft before, years earlier, though those charges had been dropped. Bridget owned a tavern and had a reputation for wearing flashy, colorful clothing, unusual for Puritan society. She had been married 3 times, which some found suspicious. She did not fit the mold of the modest Puritan woman. The evidence against Bridget was typical of Salem trials. The afflicted girls testified that her specter tormented them. Neighbors claimed that years ago, after arguments with Bridget, they or their animals had fallen ill. A laborer testified that he had seen Bridget's apparition in his bedroom. Another man claimed she had appeared to him at night, offering him a pact with the devil. Much testimony involved events from years or even decades past. Any misfortune that had followed an interaction with Bridget was now reinterpreted as witchcraft. A child's death, a cow's illness, a crop failure, all were attributed to Bridget's malefic power. The court found her guilty. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill, a rocky outcrop outside Salem town. She maintained her innocence to the end. She was stripped of the right to proper burial. Her body was thrown into a shallow grave among the rocks. With that execution, any remaining barriers fell. The court had shown it would kill. The trials accelerated. More accused were brought before the court. The pattern repeated with grim consistency. The afflicted girls testified about spectral attacks. Neighbors recalled past misfortunes they now attributed to witchcraft. The accused denied everything. The judges convicted anyway. July 19th brought 5 more executions. Sarah Good went to the gallows protesting her innocence. From the scaffold, she looked at Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who had urged her to confess. "You are a liar," she told him. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The minister ignored her. Rebecca Nurse, the machinery of the Salem witch trials operated through a specific structure. Understanding this system reveals how injustice became institutionalized, how individual cruelty was multiplied through procedure and authority. It began with accusation. Anyone could accuse anyone else of witchcraft. The afflicted girls were the most prolific accusers, but others joined them. Sometimes accusations stemmed from genuine belief. More often, they emerged from old grudges. Neighbors who had feuded for years saw an opportunity to destroy their enemies. All they needed to say was that the person's specter had visited them or that misfortune had followed an encounter with the accused. Once accused, a person was typically arrested quickly. Constables would appear at their home, often at night, and take them into custody. The accused were walked or transported to jail. They were not told what evidence existed against them. They had no right to legal counsel. Many were elderly or ill. The journey to jail was itself an ordeal. The jails were hellish. Prisoners were chained to walls or floors. They sat in their own filth. Food was minimal and of poor quality. Disease spread easily in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Winter cold and summer heat made the misery worse. Sarah Osborne died in jail before trial. Others would follow. Even if eventually released, many prisoners left permanently damaged in body and spirit. Families of the accused faced immediate suspicion. Children of accused witches were often accused themselves. The logic was that witchcraft ran in families, that mothers taught daughters the dark arts. Several mothers and daughters were jailed together. In some cases, multiple generations of a family were accused. The accused also faced financial ruin. They had to pay for their imprisonment. Each day in jail cost money. The chains that bound them cost money. Food, minimal as it was, cost money. If found guilty and executed, their estates were often seized. If found innocent and released, they still owed the jail fees. Some families lost everything. Examinations were public humiliations. The accused stood before the magistrates while the afflicted girls writhed and screamed. Every word was scrutinized for hidden meaning. If you spoke confidently, you were arrogant and clearly guilty. If you spoke haltingly, you were lying. If you showed anger at false accusations, you were revealing your evil nature. September 1692 represented the apex of Salem's madness. The trials had momentum now, a terrible efficiency. More accused filled the jails. More executions were scheduled. The court of Oyer and Terminer worked steadily through its docket of cases. The afflicted girls seemed tireless, their accusations flowing freely. September 22, 1692 would see the largest single execution day. 8 people were hanged on Gallows Hill that afternoon. The condemned included men and women, ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s. They came from different parts of the community, different social classes, different circumstances. What united them was their conviction for witchcraft and their refusal to save themselves through false confession. Martha Corey, the church member whose skepticism had marked her as suspect, stood on the scaffold. She prayed aloud as the noose was fitted around her neck. Mary Easty, sister to the already executed Rebecca Nurse, also died that day. Mary had written a petition from jail asking not for her own life but that the court change its methods so no more innocents would die. Her request was ignored. Alice Parker and an imputator were hanged together. Both were elderly women who had lived quiet lives until accusations swept them up. Mary Parker, no relation to Alice, was a widow who had tried to defend herself forcefully at trial, which only confirmed the judge's certainty of her guilt. Wilmot Red had been accused by her neighbors in Marblehead and brought to Salem for trial. Margaret Scott was in her 70s, frail and struggling to understand the charges against her. Samuel Wardwell had initially confessed under pressure but then recanted, sealing his fate. The 8 bodies were cut down and buried hastily in shallow graves near the gallows. Their families were not permitted to claim them for proper burial. This was part of the punishment, denial of Christian burial rites. But September 22nd was not yet finished with death. 3 days earlier, something even more shocking had occurred. Giles Corey, husband to the executed Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea at his trial. By law, a defendant had to plead either guilty or not guilty before trial could proceed. October 1692 brought the first real challenges to the trials. The cracks that had been forming widened into fissures. Authority figures who had supported the prosecutions began wavering. Public opinion, at least among some, shifted. Governor William Phipps returned to Massachusetts in late September from frontier military campaigns. He found the colony in chaos. Hundreds accused, jails overflowing, communities torn apart, and most troubling, his own wife had been accused during his absence. Lady Mary Phipps was in no real danger, her status protected her, but the accusation itself outraged the governor. Phipps began asking questions. He reviewed the court's procedures. He spoke with ministers who expressed concerns about spectral evidence. He heard from families whose loved ones had been executed or awaited trial. What he learned troubled him deeply. Increase Mather, the colony's most respected minister, formally presented his concerns to Phipps. On October 3rd, Mather delivered a treatise titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. His argument was clear and damning. Spectral evidence was unreliable. The devil could appear in the shape of innocent people to deceive the godly. Therefore, seeing someone's specter proved nothing about that person's guilt. Mather went further. He challenged the touch test, the searches for witches' marks, the acceptance of confessions extracted under duress. He noted that in every other area of law, multiple witnesses were required for conviction of serious crimes. Yet, in witchcraft cases, the testimony of one afflicted person, seeing things invisible to others, was enough to condemn. This violated basic principles of justice. 13 other ministers signed Mather's treatise, lending their authority to his critique. These were not radicals or skeptics but conservative Puritans who believed in witchcraft's reality. They simply argued that Salem's methods for identifying witches were dangerously flawed. The treatise created a problem for Chief Justice Stoughton and the court. They could not easily dismiss Increase Mather. He was too respected, too influential. His criticism was measured and theological, not emotional. He accepted witchcraft's existence but questioned the evidence being used to prove it. Public criticism grew louder. Thomas Brattle, a wealthy Boston merchant, wrote a scathing letter describing the trials as a travesty of justice. He detailed the court's biased procedures, the absurdity of the evidence, the cruelty of the executions. Brattle's letter circulated widely among the colony's elite. Some accused witches fought back legally. The Proctor family, after John Proctor's execution, filed complaints about the court's conduct. They detailed how testimony was manipulated, how examiners bullied the accused, how confessions were coerced. Other families joined similar protests. Reports filtered back from outlying areas where the afflicted girls had traveled to identify witches. In some cases, their performances had been less convincing. In Andover, after the girls accused many townspeople, some of those accused fled rather than submit to examination. When the accused were absent, the accusations lost power. This suggested to some that the whole phenomenon depended on the accusers and accused being in close proximity, feeding off each other. Even more damning, several people who had confessed to witchcraft began recanting. They admitted they had lied to save themselves. They described the psychological pressure, the leading questions, the implicit promise that confession would spare their lives. Their recantations undermined the web of testimony that had seemed to confirm a vast witch conspiracy. In late October, Governor Phipps took action. On October 29th, he wrote to authorities in London explaining the situation and his concerns. He noted that the spectral evidence the court relied upon was questionable. He observed that confessors were spared while those maintaining innocence were executed, creating perverse incentives. He announced he was dissolving the court of Oyer and Terminer. This was a stunning reversal. The court that had functioned for 5 months, that had condemned dozens and executed 20, was suddenly shut down. Chief Justice Stoughton was furious. He believed witches remained among them, unpunished. He argued that stopping now would embolden Satan. But Phipps had the authority and he used it. The immediate effect was to halt executions. People already convicted were not hanged. Those awaiting trial remained in jail but were not brought before the disbanded court. The prosecutions paused. But Phipps did not order the release of the accused. Over 150 people still sat in chains in various jails. Many had been there for 8 or 9 months. Their legal status was uncertain. They had been accused but not tried, or tried but not executed, or convicted by a court that no longer existed. Some prominent colonists pushed for complete abandonment of the prosecutions. They argued for releasing all the accused and compensating them for their suffering. Others, including Stoughton, insisted that witches remained among the accused and that some form of justice must continue. Phipps compromised. He would establish a new court to handle the remaining cases, but this court would operate under different rules. It would be much more skeptical of spectral evidence. It would require stronger proof of guilt. It would err on the side of caution. The Superior Court of Judicature was established in December 1692. William Stoughton would remain as Chief Justice, but he would be constrained by the new evidentiary rules. The court would begin hearing cases in January 1693. Those months between October and January were strange ones. The witch hunt had lost momentum but not ended. The afflicted girls grew quieter. Their fits became less frequent and less dramatic. Without the reinforcement of trials and executions, without constant public attention, their accusations lost power. Some families quietly fled Massachusetts. If you had been accused but not yet tried, leaving the colony was an option. Several did so, starting new lives elsewhere rather than risk the new court. Others waited anxiously in jail, hoping the new court would be more just. They had heard of the changed rules. They dared to hope for acquittal. But they also knew that Stoughton remained as Chief Justice, and his belief in the witch conspiracy had not wavered. Salem Village itself grew quieter. The intense public focus moved elsewhere. But the damage had been done. Families were shattered. Friends had accused friends. Neighbors had testified against neighbors. Trust was gone. The social fabric was torn beyond easy repair. The madness had peaked and was now declining. But its consequences would echo for centuries. Part 9. The Unraveling. January 1693 brought the Superior Court of Judicature into session. This new court faced the backlog of accused witches still languishing in jail. The atmosphere had changed dramatically from the previous summer. The hysteria had cooled. Public opinion had shifted. The new evidentiary standards made convictions much harder. The court heard 52 cases in its January session. Of these, it convicted only 3 people. Without spectral evidence as the primary proof, the cases collapsed. Testimony about past misfortunes following arguments was no longer sufficient. The touch test was deemed unreliable. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls were viewed more skeptically. Of the 3 convicted, Governor Phipps immediately granted reprieves. They would not hang. This infuriated Chief Justice Stoughton. He believed the court was releasing dangerous witches. At one point, he angrily left the bench and refused to continue presiding. He saw the new standards as coddling evil. In subsequent sessions through April and May, the court heard more cases. Grand juries, which decided whether enough evidence existed to proceed to trial, refused to indict most of the accused. Of those who did go to trial, nearly all were acquitted. By May 1693, the trials had effectively ended. Governor Phipps ordered the release of all remaining prisoners, provided they could pay their jail fees. This final requirement was cruel. Families impoverished by months of imprisonment, by loss of income and property, now had to find money to free their loved ones. Some prisoners remained in jail simply because they could not afford their release. Tituba, the first to confess, remained enslaved and in jail for a year after the trials ended. Samuel Paris refused to pay her jail fees. Eventually, another person purchased her freedom and likely her continued enslavement. She disappears from historical record after that. The afflicted girls' fates varied. And Putnam Jr., who had been one of the most prolific accusers, would later issue a public apology. In 1706, she stood before Salem Village congregation and asked forgiveness. She claimed she had been deceived by Satan, that she had believed she was seeing real specters when perhaps she had been deluded. Whether this apology was sincere or coerced by social pressure remains debated. Other afflicted girls simply moved on with their lives. They married, had children, lived quietly. Some left the area, escaping the memories and accusations that clung to them. A few continued claiming they had seen real witchcraft, defending their testimony for years. The ministers who had supported the trials faced criticism. Samuel Paris, the Salem Village minister in whose home the accusations began, lost his congregation's support. Families stopped attending services. They refused to pay his salary. After years of conflict, he resigned in 1697 and left Salem Village. He died in obscurity. Cotton Mather, who had attended executions and written approvingly of the trials, faced lasting damage to his reputation. Though he had expressed late concerns about spectral evidence, his early support for the prosecutions haunted him. Later historians would point to his role as an example of religious fanaticism overcoming reason. The judges and magistrates mostly avoided accountability. John Hathorne never expressed regret for his role. He continued in public service, apparently untroubled by having sent innocents to their deaths. William Stoughton remained convinced that the trials had been just and necessary. He believed the colony had made a mistake by stopping them. One judge did apologize. Samuel Sewall, who had served on the court of Oyer and Terminer, publicly repented in 1697. He stood in church while a statement of his guilt was read aloud. He asked God and the community for forgiveness. He acknowledged that innocent blood had been shed and that he bore responsibility. Sewall's public repentance was unusual and notable. The Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer in 1697, asking forgiveness for the trial's injustices. This was an official acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, though it stopped short of assigning individual blame. Attempts at compensation came slowly. In 1711, the colony passed legislation to restore the rights and good names of those who had been accused. It also appropriated funds to compensate families. The amounts were modest and did not come close to covering the actual losses, but they represented an attempt at restitution. Some families received compensation. Philip English and his wife Mary, wealthy merchants who had been accused, received significant recompense. The Nurse family received some payment for Rebecca's execution, but many families received little or nothing. The compensation process was complicated and prolonged. Some victims or their families never received anything. The physical scars remained visible. Gallows Hill stood as a grim reminder. The shallow graves of the executed were unmarked and neglected. Families knew their loved ones lay buried somewhere in that rocky soil, but could not locate specific graves for proper memorials. Salem Village itself struggled to recover. The community was fractured beyond repair. Trust between neighbors had been destroyed. Many families left, seeking fresh starts elsewhere. Those who remained lived with the memories and the knowledge of what they had done or allowed to be done. The meeting house where examinations had taken place carried an invisible stain. Some could not enter without remembering the screaming girls, the terrified accused, the biased magistrates. The building stood as a monument to collective madness. Economic recovery took years. Families that had lost breadwinners to execution or imprisonment struggled. Property that had been seized was not always returned fully. Legal fees and jail costs had bankrupted many households. The community's productive capacity had been damaged by the loss of so many workers to jail or flight. Psychologically, the damage ran even deeper. How do you live with having accused your neighbor of a capital crime? How do you reconcile believing you saw evil spirits when later you realize you might have been wrong? How do communities heal when the very fabric of trust has been shredded? Some never recovered. They carried guilt or trauma for the rest of their lives. Others compartmentalized, perhaps convincing themselves that they had acted in good faith given what they believed at the time. Still others simply refused to speak of it, burying the memories as they had buried the victims. The unraveling of the Salem witch trials was not clean or complete. There was no neat ending, no moment when everyone agreed it had been a terrible mistake and committed to do better. Instead, there was a slow, painful recognition of injustice, complicated by defensiveness, denial, and difficulty in admitting such profound error. The turning point in Salem's witch trials was not a single moment but a cascade of realizations. Different people reached the breaking point at different times and for different reasons. Together, these individual awakenings created the critical mass necessary to stop the madness. For Governor Phipps, the breaking point came when the accusations touched his own household. His wife's accusation, though never serious given her status, made him see the trials in a new light. If his wife could be accused, anyone could. The accusations had become indiscriminate. This personal stake made him receptive to the concerns ministers and others had been raising. For some colonists, the breaking point was watching the executions. Seeing elderly Rebecca Nurse hang, hearing George Burroughs recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly before his death, witnessing the courage and faith of the condemned created doubt. These people did not look or act like Satan's servants. They died praying and forgiving. They maintained innocence with their last breaths. The disconnect between accusation and reality became too great to ignore. For others, the breaking point was the expansion of accusations. When the afflicted girls began naming wealthy merchants, ministers' wives, and other prominent colonists, it stretched credulity. These were pillars of the community, known for piety and good works. The idea that they were witches seemed absurd. This suggested the accusations were unreliable. For the more thoughtful, the breaking point came from logical analysis. If you confessed to witchcraft, you lived. If you maintained innocence, you died. This created an obvious incentive structure that rewarded false confession and punished truthfulness. The system was designed to produce confessions, not truth. Rational people began to see this flaw and question the entire process. The confessions themselves became a breaking point. As they multiplied, they grew more fantastic. Confessors spoke of flying hundreds of miles in minutes. They described gatherings of hundreds of witches. They claimed to have transformed into animals. The details contradicted each other. Different confessors gave incompatible accounts of the same supposed events. The confessions looked less like truth and more like desperate people inventing stories to save themselves. For some families, the breaking point was personal loss. After watching a loved one executed, after months of imprisonment, after financial ruin, they could no longer support the trials. Their direct experience of injustice opened their eyes to the system's cruelty. They became vocal critics, though often only after their tragedy had already occurred. The ministers who authored concerns about spectral evidence reached their breaking point through theological reasoning. They believed in witchcraft's reality but recognized that the devil, as a deceiver, could manipulate appearances. If Satan could appear as an innocent person to frame them, then seeing someone's specter proved nothing. This theological logic undermined the trial's primary evidence. For merchants and practical-minded colonists, the breaking point was economic. The trials were destroying productivity. Farmers sat in jail during planting and harvest seasons. Merchants were accused and fled, disrupting trade. The court system was overwhelmed. Resources were being poured into prosecutions while other colony business languished. The practical cost became too high. The community of Andover experienced a collective breaking point. When the afflicted girls came to their town and accused many residents, Andover pushed back. Some accused people fled rather than submit to examination. Others confronted the accusers directly, questioning their motives and truthfulness. Without the reinforcing environment of Salem, the accusations lost power. Andover's resistance showed that the trials could be challenged. Some young people who had supported the accusations reached a breaking point as they matured. Years later, they looked back with horror at what they had participated in. And Putnam Jr.'s 1706 apology represented this delayed breaking point. Whether genuine remorse or social pressure motivated it, she publicly acknowledged that innocent people had died because of her testimony. The legal community, or at least parts of it, reached a breaking point when they examined the procedures objectively. The lack of defense counsel, the acceptance of invisible evidence, the presumption of guilt, the use of torture to extract confessions, all violated principles that even colonial justice normally upheld. Once they stepped back and compared witchcraft trials to other legal proceedings, the differences were stark and troubling. For the afflicted girls themselves, the breaking point may have come quietly and privately. As the trials ended and attention shifted away, their fits decreased. Whether they had been genuinely deluded, deliberately lying, or experiencing some psychological phenomenon, the removal of the social reinforcement seemed to end their afflictions. They stopped accusing because the audience stopped listening with the same credulity. The aggregate effect of these individual breaking points was the collapse of the trial's legitimacy. When enough people simultaneously questioned the proceedings, when criticism came from multiple quarters, governors, ministers, merchants, families, legal minds, the structure could no longer sustain itself. The trials required collective belief to function. Once that belief fractured, the whole system fell apart. But breaking points are messy. People who had supported the trials could not easily admit they had helped kill innocents. Cognitive dissonance led some to rationalize. Perhaps some of the executed really were witches, they might tell themselves, even if the process was flawed. Perhaps mistakes were made in specific cases, but the overall threat was real. These mental gymnastics allowed people to live with their actions without fully confronting the horror of what had been done. Others doubled down. Chief Justice Stoughton never reached a breaking point regarding the trial's validity. He remained convinced until his death that the prosecutions had been just and necessary. He believed the colony had made a tragic mistake by stopping the trials, allowing real witches to escape justice. His certainty never wavered. For him, there was no breaking point, no moment of clarity or regret. The community's breaking point meant the trials stopped, but it did not mean healing began immediately. The damage was too extensive, the psychological wounds too deep, the social fabric too torn. Stopping the active harm was necessary but not sufficient for recovery. That would take decades, and in some ways the recovery never fully completed. Salem's breaking point teaches us about the difficulty of stopping collective delusions. It requires multiple failures simultaneously. The political structure must withdraw support. The legal system must recognize its corruption. Public opinion must shift. Alternative explanations must become available. Economic or practical pressures must make continuation untenable. No single factor suffices. Only when several converge can the momentum be reversed. The breaking point also teaches us about human reluctance to admit error, especially deadly error. Many who participated in the trials never fully acknowledged their role or its consequences. They minimized their involvement, rationalized their actions, or simply refused to discuss it. True accountability was rare. Samuel Sewell's public apology stood out precisely because it was so unusual. We see in Salem's breaking point both the possibility and the difficulty of societal course correction. Communities can recognize they have gone terribly wrong. They can stop destructive processes. But doing so requires moral courage, intellectual honesty, and willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Salem managed this barely and belatedly, but only after 24 people had died and hundreds more had suffered. After the trials ended, Salem faced the question of what survived. Physically, emotionally, socially, what remained of the community and the individuals who had lived through this nightmare. The survivors of false accusation carried visible and invisible scars. Those who had been imprisoned for months emerged changed. The physical toll was obvious. They were thinner, weaker, often ill from the conditions they had endured. Chains had left marks on wrists and ankles. Malnutrition had damaged their bodies. Some would never fully recover their health. The psychological damage ran deeper. Imagine being accused by your neighbors of the worst possible crime. Imagine sitting in a dark cell, uncertain if you would be executed. Imagine the betrayal of seeing people you had known your entire life testify against you. This trauma marked survivors permanently. Many struggled with nightmares, anxiety, difficulty trusting others. In an era without understanding of post-traumatic stress, they had no framework for their suffering. Elizabeth Proctor survived because her pregnancy delayed execution until the trials had ended. She lost her husband John to the gallows. She emerged from prison to find her life destroyed. Her property had been seized. Her children had been scattered to relatives. Her reputation, though officially restored, carried a stain. She eventually remarried and lived into old age, but she carried the memory of her husband's execution and her own near death for the rest of her life. The children of the executed faced particular challenges. They were orphans marked by their parents' fates. Some communities viewed them with suspicion. Would they seek revenge? Did they carry their parents' supposed evil? These children grew up under clouds of doubt and pity. Some left Massachusetts to escape their histories. Others stayed but lived quietly, trying to avoid attention. Sarah Good's daughter Dorcas was 4 years old when she was accused of witchcraft alongside her mother. The child was imprisoned and kept in chains. The psychological impact of this treatment on a 4-year-old was devastating. After release, Dorcas was reportedly never mentally healthy. Her mother's execution and her own imprisonment had broken something in her. She remained dependent on others for care for the rest of her life. Financially, many families never recovered. The combination of lost income during imprisonment, seized property, jail fees, and legal costs bankrupted households. The compensation payments made years later were inadequate. Families that had been comfortable became poor. Some had to sell land to pay debts. The economic impact cascaded through generations. Documents survived that would later prove crucial for historians. Court records, though incomplete, preserved testimony and procedures. Personal letters and diaries captured individual experiences. Reverend Samuel Parris kept detailed records of the examinations that took place in the meeting house. These sources, scattered across various archives, would allow future generations to reconstruct what happened. The physical locations remained but carried different meanings. Gallows Hill became a place of memory and shame. The shallow graves of the executed were gradually forgotten. No markers indicated who lay where. The land was eventually developed, built upon, the bones likely disturbed or destroyed over the centuries. Only in recent years have researchers attempted to identify the exact execution site. The meeting house where examinations occurred continued as a place of worship, though many found it difficult to pray in a space where such injustice had unfolded. The building was eventually torn down and replaced, but the site retained its history. Salem Village itself struggled with its identity. The community petitioned to change its name, wanting to distance itself from the trial's infamy. In 1752, Salem Village became Danvers. The name change could not erase the past, but it represented an attempt to move forward. Some families left the area entirely. They moved to other colonies or to frontier regions where they could start fresh without the weight of Salem's history. These migrations scattered the trauma geographically but also spread the story. Survivors or their children carried the memory to new places, telling their stories in new communities. Knowledge survived in unexpected ways. The trials had demonstrated the dangers of spectral evidence, of accepting invisible testimony. This became a cautionary lesson in legal circles. Future courts would be more skeptical of extraordinary claims unsupported by physical evidence. Salem's mistakes taught later generations about evidentiary standards and the importance of defendant rights. The theological arguments developed in response to the trials also survived. Ministers' treatises on the limitations of spectral evidence, on the devil's ability to deceive, on the proper standards for identifying witchcraft, these works became part of religious and legal literature. They influenced thinking about witchcraft prosecutions throughout colonial America and even in Europe. Cautionary literature emerged. Books and pamphlets described the trials as examples of how good people could be led astray by fear and false testimony. These works sometimes exaggerated or misrepresented details, but they kept the memory alive and framed it as a moral lesson. Surprisingly, belief in witchcraft itself survived among many colonists. The trials did not convince most people that witchcraft was impossible. Instead, they convinced people that identifying witches was more difficult than previously thought, that false accusations were possible, that spectral evidence was unreliable. The supernatural worldview remained intact. Only the methods for proving supernatural crimes were questioned. Some positive changes emerged from the tragedy. Massachusetts reformed its legal procedures. The standards for conviction in criminal cases became stricter. The rights of the accused received more attention. Defense counsel became more common. Torture to extract confessions was viewed more skeptically. Salem's injustice contributed to improving colonial justice, though progress was slow and incomplete. The community's social structure survived but transformed. Old power dynamics shifted. The Putnam family, whose members had been so involved in accusations, lost influence. Other families rose to prominence. The bitter feuds that had helped fuel the accusations gradually faded as older generations died and younger ones had less investment in ancient grudges. Religious practice continued but with some modifications. The harsh, judgmental style of preaching that characterized figures like Samuel Parris became less popular. Congregations wanted ministers who emphasized mercy and grace more than fire and judgment. The trials had shown where an excessive certainty about identifying God's enemies could lead. Memory itself remained, passed down through families and communities. Descendants of the executed kept their ancestors' stories alive. Descendants of the accusers often remained silent, uncomfortable with their family histories. This selective memory meant that the victims' perspectives survived more prominently than the perpetrators' justifications. What remained, ultimately, was a scar on the American conscience. The Salem witch trials became a reference point, a phrase that conjured images of injustice and hysteria. Witch hunt entered the language as a metaphor for baseless accusations and persecution. The trial's legacy outlasted all the participants, becoming part of how Americans understood the dangers of unchecked power and mob mentality. The Salem witch trials did not end in 1693. They lived on in memory, myth, literature, and law. How later generations remembered and interpreted Salem reveals as much about those generations as it does about the original events. In the immediate aftermath, silence dominated. Salem was an embarrassment. Participants did not want to discuss their roles. The community wanted to move forward and forget. For decades, the trials were a shameful secret more than a topic of reflection. Books were not written. Commemorations did not occur. The collective impulse was to bury the memory along with the victims. But stories survived orally. Families of the executed kept the memory alive, passing down accounts from grandparents to grandchildren. These personal histories maintained details that official records missed: the human dimension of suffering, the small acts of courage or cruelty, the way lives were forever altered. The first major published account came in 1764 when Thomas Hutchinson, who later became Royal Governor of Massachusetts, wrote about the trials in his History of the Colony. Hutchinson had access to original documents and interviewed people who remembered the events. His account was relatively balanced, acknowledging injustice while trying to understand the mindset of 1692. He noted that the participants had believed they were fighting real evil, even as they perpetrated injustice. As America moved toward revolution, Salem acquired new symbolic meaning. Colonists angry at British authorities drew parallels between Salem's judicial failures and contemporary grievances. The trials became an example of what happened when power operated without proper checks, when courts served political ends rather than justice. Revolutionaries used Salem to argue for stronger protections for the accused and limits on governmental authority. The 19th century brought increased interest in Salem. The Romantic movement's fascination with the supernatural and the Gothic made the witch trials attractive material for artists and writers. But this interest often distorted history. The trials became spooky stories, more about atmosphere than accuracy. Real suffering was transformed into entertainment. Nathaniel Hawthorne, descended from John Hathorne the magistrate, wrote extensively about Salem and inherited guilt. His stories explored themes of sin, judgment, and the weight of ancestral crimes. Hawthorne changed the spelling of his name, adding a W, perhaps to distance himself from his infamous ancestor. His work, The House of the Seven Gables, deals with curses and historical guilt, reflecting his wrestling with family legacy. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, became the most influential artistic interpretation of Salem. Miller wrote it as an allegory for McCarthyism and the anti-communist hearings of the 1950s. He drew explicit parallels between Salem's witch hunt and contemporary persecution of suspected communists. The play took historical liberties, changing characters' ages, inventing a romantic subplot, simplifying motivations, but captured essential truths about mass hysteria and the corruption of justice by fear. The Crucible introduced Salem to millions who might never have encountered the history otherwise. For many people, Miller's interpretation became their understanding of the events. The play succeeded in making Salem relevant to modern audiences, showing how 17th century lessons applied to 20th century problems. It demonstrated that witch hunts were not relics of superstitious eras but recurring patterns that could emerge anywhere fear overwhelmed reason. Legal scholars studied Salem extensively. The trials became a standard example in discussions of defendant rights, evidentiary standards, and the dangers of moral panic affecting judicial proceedings. Every element that made Salem unjust, the lack of defense counsel, the acceptance of spectral evidence, the presumption of guilt, the use of coerced confessions, became a cautionary tale about what legal systems must avoid. The phrase witch hunt entered common usage as a metaphor. Politicians accused of wrongdoing would claim to be victims of witch hunts. Prosecutors pursuing controversial cases were accused of conducting witch hunts. The term was applied broadly, sometimes appropriately, often not. Its very flexibility showed Salem's cultural penetration. Everyone understood the reference, even if they disagreed about when the comparison was valid. Modern Salem, now the city of Salem, Massachusetts, built an identity around the trials. The witch became a tourist symbol. Museums, tours, shops, and attractions cater to visitors interested in witchcraft history. October brings massive crowds for Halloween festivities. This commercialization troubles some, who see it as trivializing real suffering. Others view it as an economic necessity and a way to keep history alive. Descendants of both victims and accusers organized and connected. The Nurse family, descendants of Rebecca Nurse, maintained her memory and fought for proper commemoration. In 1885, they erected a monument to her. Other families followed suit, creating memorials for their executed ancestors. These private acts of remembrance gradually became the 20th and 21st centuries brought unprecedented scholarly attention to Salem. Historians dug deeper into archives, discovered new documents, applied modern analytical methods, and challenged previous assumptions. This rediscovery process revealed complexities that earlier interpreters had missed. Archaeological work contributed new understanding. Researchers excavated sites connected to the trials. In 2016, scholars announced they had identified the exact location of the executions on Gallows Hill. Using combination of historical documents, geological surveys, and ground-penetrating radar, they pinpointed where the condemned had been hanged. The site was smaller and rockier than previously thought, a detail that somehow made the executions more real and more horrible to imagine. The discovery process was meticulous. Researchers examined witness accounts describing landmarks near the execution site. They studied soil composition and terrain features. They considered practical factors: accessibility for carts carrying the condemned, visibility for the crowds who watched, suitability for hangings. The convergence of evidence pointed to a specific ledge on Proctor's Ledge on Gallows Hill. This discovery mattered because it gave the victims a place. For over 300 years, the exact execution site had been forgotten. Now it could be properly memorialized. In 2017, Salem dedicated a small memorial there. The contrast between the site's unremarkable appearance and its terrible history was striking. Nothing about the landscape suggested the horrors it had witnessed. Digital humanities projects created databases of trial documents. Researchers transcribed original handwritten records, making them accessible online. These databases allowed scholars worldwide to study the primary sources. They enabled new types of analysis, tracking social networks among the accused and accusers, mapping geographic patterns of accusations, analyzing language patterns in testimony. Genealogical research traced descendants of everyone involved. These family trees revealed surprising connections. Some descendants of accusers married descendants of the accused. Family lines that had been bitterly opposed in 1692 had merged in subsequent generations. This finding suggested that communities eventually healed, at least partially, through intermarriage and shared history. Modern interpretations increasingly focused on social and economic factors. Historians mapped property holdings and found patterns. Accusers often came from families in declining economic situations. The accused frequently had property. Others explored the possibility of deliberate fraud mixed with genuine delusion. Perhaps the afflicted girls began with real experiences: dreams, illness, stress reactions, and and then consciously amplified them when they saw the impact. The line between belief and performance may have blurred, especially for young girls caught in circumstances beyond their control. Medical historians considered various organic explanations. The ergot poisoning theory, though popular, faced challenges. Ergot typically affected whole communities, not just select individuals. It caused different symptoms than those described. Alternative explanations included encephalitis, epilepsy, or Huntington's disease, but none fit perfectly. The most likely explanation remained psychological, rooted in the extreme stress of Puritan childhood and the social dynamics of the community. Comparative studies placed Salem in broader context. Researchers examined which trials in Europe, which had killed tens of thousands over several centuries. Salem's death toll was relatively small by comparison. This did not diminish its horror but showed it was part of a widespread phenomenon. Witch hunts emerged repeatedly across different cultures when specific conditions converged: religious upheaval, social stress, weakened institutions, available scapegoats. Modern interpretations grappled with the role of Tituba and slavery in the trials. Early accounts often portrayed Tituba as introducing the girls to voodoo or Caribbean magic, supposedly triggering their afflictions. More recent scholarship challenged this racialized narrative. Tituba's confession was likely coerced and reflected what her interrogators wanted to hear more than authentic Caribbean practices. The rush to blame an enslaved woman of color reflected colonial racism, then and in later historical accounts. The Native American context received increased attention. King William's War raged on the frontier during the trials. Refugees from destroyed settlements brought horrifying stories of violence. Several of the afflicted girls had witnessed Indian attacks, seen family members killed. Some historians argued that trauma from frontier warfare manifested in the trials. The enemy without became projected as an enemy within. Satan and his witches replaced Indians as the visible threat. Legal scholars continued mining Salem for lessons. The trials illustrated the importance of the presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, the prohibition on coerced confessions, the limits of testimony about invisible or unprovable phenomena. Every reform in criminal procedure could point to Salem as justification. If such injustice occurred once, strong protections must prevent recurrence. Memory studies examined how Salem was remembered and forgotten across generations. Why did some victims remain obscure while others became famous? Why did certain narratives dominate while others faded? These questions revealed that memory is selective and politically charged. Communities remember what serves contemporary needs and forget what discomforts them. The debate continues about how to balance remembrance with moving forward. Should modern Salem embrace or downplay its history? Should descendants of participants bear any responsibility for ancestral actions? How much commemoration is appropriate, and when does it become exploitation? These questions lack easy answers. Recent scholarship emphasized listening to women's voices. Most primary sources were written by men, magistrates, ministers, chroniclers. Women's testimony appeared only as recorded by men in court proceedings. Historians worked to recover female perspectives by reading between the lines, analyzing what women said despite hostile contexts, considering what women might have meant differently than how men interpreted them. The ongoing relevance of Salem to current events ensures continued reinterpretation. Each moral panic, each wave of baseless accusations, each example of prejudice masquerading as justice invites comparison to Salem. The trials function as a mirror, reflecting contemporary concerns back to those who study them. This may be their ultimate legacy, not as a closed historical chapter but as an open question that each generation must answer anew. How do we prevent Salem from happening again? What within ourselves and our institutions makes such failures possible? How do we build communities where fear does not overwhelm justice? Step back now from the specific events of Salem and consider what they reveal about human nature and society. The trials were not unique to 17th century Massachusetts or to Puritanism. They manifest patterns that appear repeatedly throughout history. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize when we risk repeating them. At the heart of Salem lies the danger of absolute certainty. The Puritans believed completely in their worldview. God and Satan were real and actively involved in human affairs. Witches existed and posed genuine threats. This certainty allowed no room for doubt. Once the afflicted girls named witches, those beliefs made questioning dangerous. To doubt the accusers was to side with evil. This pattern appears everywhere. When ideology becomes absolute truth, when questioning marks you as an enemy, when purity tests exclude the doubtful, these are warning signs. Salem teaches that some uncertainty is healthy. The ability to say, "I might be wrong," protects against fanaticism. Those who cannot doubt cannot correct their errors until it's too late. Salem reveals how fear transforms communities. Afraid people do not think clearly. They accept extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. They sacrifice principles for the illusion of security. The frontier war created ambient fear that the trials channeled inward. Unable to defeat the external enemy, Salem attacked an internal one. This pattern recurs. Societies under stress, facing real or perceived threats, often turn on themselves. They seek enemies within to explain their troubles. The enemy might be political dissidents, religious minorities, immigrants, or any available scapegoat. Fear makes people cruel and drives them to sacrifice justice for the promise of safety. Salem demonstrates how power corrupts oversight. The magistrates and judges held tremendous authority with minimal accountability. They answered to no higher court. They faced no penalty for errors. This unchecked power allowed bias and cruelty to flourish. Chief Justice Stoughton believed absolutely in his righteousness, which made him dangerous. He could condemn innocence while thinking himself virtuous. Every society needs mechanisms to check power. Courts need appeals processes. Leaders need limits. No individual or institution should be beyond question. Salem, the late afternoon sun slants across Gallows Hill now, 3 centuries after the last execution. Stand there for a moment. Feel the wind that cuts across this rocky ledge. Nothing marks the spot where they died except, finally, a small memorial, understated and somber. The city spreads below, modern and bustling. Traffic sounds drift upward. Life continues, indifferent to this ground's history. But history is never truly past. Those who died here left echoes that still resound. Rebecca Nurse's courage, maintaining innocence to the end. Sarah Good's bitter curse that proved prophetic. Giles Corey's defiant request for more weight, rather than submit to false conviction. These moments of humanity in the face of inhuman proceedings remain vivid across the centuries. What makes Salem haunt us is not its uniqueness but its familiarity. We recognize ourselves in that community. We see our own capacity for fear-driven cruelty. We understand how good intentions can pave roads to horror. We know that certainty can become fanaticism, that justice can corrupt into vengeance, that communities can turn savagely on their own. The trials lasted less than a year. The consequences lasted lifetimes. For those who endured false imprisonment, the trauma never fully healed. For those who lost loved ones to execution, the grief never entirely faded. For the community, the trust never completely returned. Some wounds cut too deep for time alone to heal them. Yet Salem also offers hope. The trials ended because people found the courage to question, to doubt, to resist. Ministers who risked their reputations by challenging spectral evidence. A governor who chose conscience over political pressure. Citizens who defended the accused despite personal risk. Individuals who proved that moral courage could exist even in moments of collective madness. The executed left no graves we can visit, no stones bearing their names. Their bodies lie somewhere in unmarked earth, precisely where forgotten. But their stories survived. Their names are remembered. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs, Sarah Good, Bridget Bishop, Giles Corey, Martha Corey, Mary Easty, all the others who died maintaining innocence. The community tried to erase them, but memory proved stronger than death. Today, Salem struggles with its dual identity. It is a place of historical tragedy and a tourist destination. Witch-themed shops line the streets. Halloween brings massive crowds. Some find this commercialization disturbing, a trivializing of real suffering. Others argue that keeping Salem in public consciousness, even through commercial means, serves the important purpose of preventing the history from being forgotten entirely. The deeper legacy lives in law and ethics. Every protection criminal defendants enjoy today traces partly back to Salem's lessons. The right to counsel, the presumption of innocence, the requirement for physical evidence, the prohibition on torture and coerced confession. These safeguards exist because societies learned, painfully and slowly, what happens without them. Salem entered language and culture as a reference point. Witch hunt needs no explanation. Everyone understands the metaphor. Baseless accusations, mob mentality, rush to judgment, persecution of the innocent. The phrase's power shows Salem's educational impact. These events from 3 centuries ago still shape how we think about justice and injustice. For descendants of both victims and accusers, Salem remains personal. Some carry pride in ancestors who resisted or suffered unjustly. Others carry discomfort about ancestors who participated in persecution. Both groups face questions about inherited responsibility. Do we bear guilt for ancestral crimes? Must we atone for what our forebears did? These questions resist easy answers but are worth asking. Stand on Gallows Hill at sunset. Imagine the crowds that gathered here, the cart carrying the condemned, the ladder propped against the tree, the noose. Imagine the prayers, the protests of innocence, the silence that followed. Then imagine the walk back to the village afterward, neighbors avoiding each other's eyes, beginning the slow process of realizing what they had done. The Salem witch trials were not supernatural. No specters flew through the night. No witches gathered to plot with Satan. What happened was entirely human. Fear, cruelty, deception, mass delusion, the corruption of justice, the failure of community. This makes Salem more terrifying, not less. We cannot dismiss it as superstitious primitives doing primitive things. We must recognize our ancestors' humanity and therefore our own capacity for similar failures. But we must also recognize the possibility of redemption. Samuel Sewall stood in church and publicly repented. And Putnam Jr. apologized for her accusations. The colony established a day of fasting and prayer to acknowledge wrongs done. Massachusetts eventually compensated victims' families and cleared their names. These acts came late and were insufficient, but they were something. They showed that acknowledgement of error is possible, that communities can choose to face their darkest hours rather than bury them. What do we owe the dead of Salem? Perhaps we owe them memory, honest and unflinching. We owe them the effort to understand what happened and why, without simplification or excuse. We owe them the determination to learn from their suffering, to build better systems of justice, to resist the patterns that led to their deaths. We owe them vigilance. Watch for the signs that Salem teaches us to recognize. When fear drives policy, when certainty crushes doubt, when accusations need no evidence, when dissent becomes treason, when the vulnerable are scapegoated, when power operates without check. These are Salem's warning signs, relevant in every era. We owe them humility. None of us can be certain we would have been the brave dissenter rather than the frightened conformist. Few of us possess the courage of Rebecca Nurse or Giles Corey. Most of us, placed in that context, might have gone along, might have participated, might have convinced ourselves that we were fighting real evil. This uncomfortable self-knowledge should generate empathy and caution. Finally, we owe them the story. Tell it to each generation. Teach children what happened when fear overwhelmed reason. Show them how quickly the familiar can become terrifying. Help them understand that defending justice requires constant effort, that freedom needs eternal vigilance, that the line between civilization and barbarity is thinner than we'd like to believe. The sun sets over Salem now. Shadows lengthen across Gallows Hill. In the fading light, you can almost see them, the accused standing at the edge, looking out over the community that condemned them, speaking their final words, maintaining innocence to the end. They died, but their story lives. In that survival lies both warning and promise. Salem teaches us what we must avoid.